The hum of the factory was a sound Ellie Hartman knew by heart. The steady clatter of machines, the rhythmic punch of metal, the faint hiss of oil and sweat that hung in the air. It was the soundtrack of her days, and the echo that followed her into restless dreams at night. She worked in the munitions plant on the edge of Peoria, Illinois, turning brass casings into bullets that would soon cross the ocean in crates stamped, property of the U.S. Army. Each round she touched felt like a whisper from a war she'd never see. The war was everywhere, though. In the newsreels that flickered on the theater screen. In the ration stamps tucked into kitchen drawers. In the empty seat at the family's dinner table, where her brother James used to sit. He'd enlisted the week after Pearl Harbor. The last letter he sent arrived in a wrinkled envelope smudged with mud. "We're moving through France now," he wrote. "Don't worry about me, Elle. You just keep those bullets coming." She read that line over and over, feeling both proud and powerless. She was doing her part, yes, but the truth gnawed at her. She wasn't there. She wasn't doing. Every evening she walked home from the plant, the faint smell of gunpowder clinging to her skin like guilt. Her father, once a strong and cheerful man who ran the local hardware store, had grown pale and thin after a lung infection. He coughed through most nights, refusing to go to the doctor because men have to be strong for the family. Her mother, weary and practical, managed the home and worried in silence. "You're doing enough, Ellie," she often said. "You're helping the boys fight. That's more than most." But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that assembling bullets wasn't the same as facing the fear those bullets were meant for. Sometimes, late at night, she'd stand by her window and stare at the stars, imagining the world beyond, the fields of Europe lit by fire, the thunder of tanks, the cries of soldiers. She wasn't a violent person, but she longed to matter, to feel the war she was helping to fight. She wanted to see courage, to test her own limits, to know what kind of person she'd be when everything fell apart. One evening in early spring 1943, her best friend Mabel came running into the factory locker room, waving a newspaper. "Ellie, did you see this?" she said breathlessly. "They're letting women join the Army now, the Women's Army Corps. They're looking for clerks, radio operators, truck drivers, nurses, all kinds of jobs." Ellie blinked, wiping sweat from her brow. "Real Army? Not just factory work?" Mabel grinned. "Real uniforms, real pay, real travel. You could end up in Europe." The idea seemed ridiculous. A small-town girl with no military training marching in step with soldiers? But the seed was planted. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. She read the article again by lamplight, the headline blurring under her fingertips. "Women's Army Corps opens new doors." Beneath it, a quote from General Eisenhower. "Every available woman is needed to win this war." Her heart pounded as she whispered to herself, "Maybe they need me too." The next morning, she mentioned it at breakfast. Her mother froze, her spoon clattering against the bowl. "Ellie Hartman, don't be foolish. That's no place for a girl. You'll end up cleaning boots in some muddy camp. It's dangerous." Ellie looked down at her hands, stained faintly with brass dust. "So is doing nothing," she said quietly. Her father coughed, eyes soft with concern. "Sweetheart, you've done enough for your country. You're keeping the boys alive with what you make. That's brave enough." But it didn't feel brave. It felt safe. And safety felt like failure when James was dodging bullets across the ocean. Days passed, but the thought wouldn't leave her. Every shift, every bullet casing she loaded, every clink of metal sounded like a call she couldn't ignore. She began writing a letter of application in secret, folding it neatly beneath her pillow. When the acceptance arrived, a crisp letterhead stamped with the insignia of the Women's Army Corps. Her hands trembled as she read it. "You are to report to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, for training within 2 weeks. That evening, she packed her small suitcase. Her mother stood in the doorway, silent. "You'll be fine," Ellie said softly, forcing a smile. "It's just training. I'll be behind the lines, safe." Her mother's eyes glistened. That's what they all say before they leave. The train station was crowded with uniforms and tearful goodbyes. Ellie clutched her ticket, her heart racing as the whistle blew. The journey south took 2 days, through endless fields and towns filled with war posters and ration lines. She sat by the window, watching the world blur past, feeling the thrill of leaving everything familiar behind. Fort Oglethorpe was a different world. Rows of barracks, the sharp scent of disinfectant and leather boots, the bark of drill sergeants slicing through the morning air. "Welcome to the United States Army," one officer shouted. "You're soldiers now. Act like it." Ellie wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Her first week was brutal. Early wake-ups, blisters from endless marching, and endless lectures on discipline. Some women broke down and quit. Ellie refused. Every night, she scrubbed her boots until they shone and practiced her salute until her wrist ached. She wasn't strong, but she was stubborn. And that, she realized, mattered more. She made friends. A nurse from Kansas named Ruth, a driver from New York named Gloria. Women who, like her, were tired of being told what they couldn't do. They shared stories under flickering lights, their laughter echoing across the barracks. For the first time, Ellie felt she belonged somewhere that demanded her best. When she completed training, her commanding officer handed her new orders. "Hartman, you're assigned to the 256th Ammunition Transport Unit, Europe bound." Her heart skipped. "Europe, sir?" He nodded. "You'll be handling ammunition shipments in the field. It's not glamorous, but it's vital. And it's close to the front, so keep your head down." Close to the front. The words both thrilled and terrified her. 2 weeks later, she stood on the deck of a transport ship as it pulled away from New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty glowed in the distance, half shrouded in mist. Around her, women and men crowded the rails, waving at the skyline as it faded. Ellie gripped the cold railing and whispered a prayer for courage. The sea stretched ahead, endless, dark, uncertain. For the first time in her life, she was heading straight into history. She didn't know what awaited her across the ocean. Fear, loss, maybe even death. But deep in her heart, she knew one thing for certain. She would never again be just a factory girl making bullets for someone else's fight. Soon she would be there when the bullets were fired, and when courage would be tested for real. The sea was endless. Days bled into nights aboard the troopship, the horizon an unbroken line between water and gray sky. Ellie Hartman stood on the deck each morning, her uniform collar stiff against the cold wind, staring out where the Atlantic met the heavens. The salt burned her lips, but she didn't care. It made her feel alive. She was heading toward something real, something unknown. The transport ship, the USS Frederick, was a floating maze of noise and nerves. Hundreds of soldiers filled its decks, men bound for the front lines, nurses, mechanics, cooks, and Ellie's group of women from the 256th Ammunition Transport Unit. Their task sounded simple: deliver bullets, shells, and explosives to the men who would fire them. But everyone knew that nothing about this war was simple. Nights were the hardest. The ship went dark to avoid German submarines, every porthole sealed tight. Only the steady hum of the engines filled the blackness. Ellie lay awake in her narrow bunk, listening to the restless shifting of soldiers and the quiet sobs of girls trying not to be afraid. Somewhere out there, under the same ocean, were U-boats hunting them. A single torpedo could end it all. She'd whisper to herself in the dark, "Keep breathing. Keep steady. You chose this." Her closest bunkmate, Ruth, the nurse from Kansas, often whispered back, "If we die, at least we'll go out doing something that matters." Ellie smiled faintly. That's one way to think about it. When the ship finally reached England, gray clouds hung low and heavy over the port of Southampton. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet earth. Everything was darker than home. The buildings, the uniforms, even the sky. War had painted everything in shades of worry. They were assigned to a staging camp outside London, where Ellie's unit trained in convoy operations. Rows of trucks lined the muddy field, their tarps slick with rain. Sergeant Jenkins, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl, drilled them relentlessly. "You're not ladies here," he barked. "You're soldiers. You'll drive, load, and unload faster than any man if you want to survive." Ellie's back ached from hauling crates. Her hands blistered from tying down cargo straps. But she refused to quit. The first time she backed a 2-ton truck into formation without stalling, Jenkins actually nodded. That single gesture felt like a medal. At night, the distant drone of enemy bombers rolled across the sky. The women would duck into trenches as searchlights swept the clouds. Ellie remembered one evening when a nearby warehouse took a direct hit. The explosion rattled her teeth, and the ground shook as flames tore through the night. "Still want to be here?" Ruth asked, voice trembling. "Yes," Ellie whispered, surprising herself with how certain she sounded. "I think I do." After weeks of preparation, the order finally came. Their unit would deploy to France to support operations in the Normandy region. The D-Day invasion had happened only a short time earlier, and the Allied forces were still pushing inland. Rumors spread of fierce fighting, of villages reduced to ashes, of casualties beyond counting. When Ellie boarded the landing craft that would carry them to the French coast, she saw the remnants of war everywhere, twisted metal floating in the surf, burned-out tanks half buried in sand, helmets scattered like broken shells. The boat hit the beach hard. The ramp dropped with a metallic slam, and a rush of damp, salty air filled her lungs. Soldiers shouted orders as trucks rolled off the vessel. The beach was quieter now than on D-Day, but the ghosts of that invasion seemed to linger in the air. Ellie looked around at the torn earth and felt the weight of it all. "Welcome to France," Sergeant Jenkins muttered. "Keep your head down and do your job." Their first camp was set up behind a ridge near the coast. Canvas tents, mud floors, and the constant rumble of artillery in the distance. This was home now. Ellie's job was to help coordinate ammunition runs from the port to supply depots near the front. She learned to read maps, to calculate fuel, to check every crate twice. The work was exhausting, but she found comfort in the routine. Then came the first real run to the front lines. Their convoy consisted of 5 trucks, each loaded with crates of ammunition and mortar shells. Ellie rode in the third vehicle, squeezed between the driver, Private McKinney, and another transport worker. They followed winding dirt roads through villages reduced to rubble. Windows were shattered, fields cratered by bombs. The smell of smoke and decay clung to everything. As they passed through one half-destroyed town, Ellie saw children watching from doorways, small faces pale and hollow-eyed. One girl clutched a ragged doll, waving weakly as the trucks passed. Ellie waved back, tears burning in her eyes. "God," she whispered, "how do they still have hope?" Hours later, they reached a forward supply base, a muddy clearing surrounded by sandbags and foxholes. Soldiers swarmed around, shouting for ammo, cigarettes, water, anything. Ellie climbed down and helped unload crates, her muscles straining, her boots sinking into the mud. She worked beside men who looked twice her age, but couldn't have been older than 20. That's where she met Sergeant David Collins for the first time. He was tall, lean, and calm in a way that steadied everyone around him. His uniform was filthy, his face streaked with grime, but when he spoke, his voice carried quiet authority. "You knew?" he asked, offering her a canteen. "Yes, sir." "First run," she said, catching her breath. He nodded. "You did good getting here. Not everyone does. Keep your head down, and don't trust quiet roads. That's when they're watching." Ellie managed a shaky smile. "I'll remember that." For the next week, their unit made trip after trip, ferrying ammunition under constant risk. German snipers and air raids were common. Every convoy was a gamble. Ellie's nerves hardened. She learned to flinch less at distant gunfire, to duck instinctively when planes roared overhead. One night, while loading supplies by lantern light, she asked Collins, "Do you ever stop being scared?" He chuckled softly. "No, you just get better at hiding it." His words stayed with her. Fear was still there, but now it had a place beside courage. On her last night before the next big convoy, Ellie wrote a letter home. She described the sky over Normandy, how the stars looked sharper, as if war had burned the air clean. She didn't tell her parents how close she was to the fighting. She didn't mention the bodies they sometimes passed on the roadside, or the thunder that shook the ground each night. Some truths were too heavy for home. When she finished, she folded the letter neatly and sealed it with trembling fingers. She had no way of knowing if it would ever reach Illinois. The next morning, rain poured as they prepared to move out again. The convoy engines growled in the mist. Sergeant Collins approached her truck, rain dripping from his helmet. "Stick close today," he said. "The roads ahead aren't safe. There's been trouble near the forest." Ellie nodded, gripping the door handle tighter than she meant to. Her stomach twisted with unease she couldn't explain. As the trucks rolled forward into the fog, she glanced back at the coast, at the distant waves breaking against the shore she'd landed on days before. She didn't know it yet, but this convoy would change everything. The road ahead would lead her straight into fire, and force her to become the soldier no one ever trained her to be. The first thing Ellie noticed when they reached the forward zone wasn't the sound of gunfire. It was the silence between the shots. That eerie, loaded quiet that came just before the next explosion. It was the kind of silence that made you hold your breath without realizing it, as though the air itself knew what was coming. Their convoy rattled down a narrow dirt road just past St. Lai, where the land was nothing but shattered trees and broken stone. Every mile felt like an hour. The truck bounced over craters, its engine coughing against the mud. Smoke curled in the distance where artillery had torn through another ridge. Ellie sat in the passenger seat, her hands wide around the edge of her seat, watching the world roll by in ruins. Private McKinney tried to lighten the mood. "Beautiful countryside, huh?" he muttered with a grim half-smile. Ellie forced a laugh. "If you like your flowers burned." They both knew humor was the only thing keeping fear from taking over. When they reached the supply camp, the air reeked of oil, blood, and cordite, the unmistakable stench of war. Men moved like shadows through the haze, shouting orders, carrying crates, wiping sweat from soot-streaked faces. Somewhere behind the hills, the guns boomed again, each thud vibrating through the ground like a heartbeat. Ellie climbed down, her boots sinking into the thick, sticky mud. "Get those shells to the East Trench." A corporal barked, pointing to a pile of crates that weighed more than she did. She nodded, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. It didn't matter that she wasn't trained for combat. Out here, everyone carried something heavy: fear, grief, or ammunition. Hours passed. Her arms burned, her back screamed, and the noise never stopped. Trucks came and went in clouds of dust. Once, a medic stumbled past, blood splattered across his sleeves, dragging a wounded man by the shoulders. Ellie froze for a second, staring at the soldier's blank stare. She'd seen death before in movies, in headlines, but never this close. Never where it could smell like metal and smoke and something final. That night, she couldn't sleep. The tent rattled every time an artillery gun fired in the distance. Some of the girls whispered to each other to stay calm. Others cried quietly under their blankets. Ellie just lay there, eyes open, staring at the tent's canvas roof. The fear was real. Now, not just an idea. It had a sound, a smell, a pulse. At dawn, Sergeant Collins stopped by her tent. His uniform was already damp with dew, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "We're short on hands this morning," he said. "Need a few from your unit to help load transport trucks. Can you handle that?" "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Collins smiled faintly. "Good. I knew you'd say that." They worked side by side for hours, stacking wooden crates of .30 caliber rounds into the back of a truck. Collins moved with calm efficiency, shouting orders over the din. He seemed untouched by the chaos, and Ellie found herself watching him more than she meant to. He had a way of keeping people together, of making the noise seem less overwhelming. During a short break, they sat on a crate sharing a canteen. The sun was weak, barely pushing through the haze. Collins looked over at her and asked, "You ever thought it'd be like this?" Ellie shook her head. "No. I thought I'd be somewhere safe. Behind a desk, maybe. Typing reports." He chuckled softly. "War doesn't care what you thought it would be." She smiled, though her stomach churned. "Doesn't seem to care about much at all." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's where we come in. Someone's got to care enough to keep the rest of it from falling apart." That night, while unloading the final truck, they heard the whistle of incoming shells, long, high, and terrifying. "Down!" someone screamed. Ellie threw herself into the mud, just as an explosion tore through a fuel barrel nearby. The shockwave lifted her off the ground and slammed her back into the dirt. Ears ringing, heart pounding, she scrambled behind a sandbag wall. When the dust cleared, flames roared across the supply yard. Men shouted, trying to smother the fire before it reached the ammunition piles. Collins appeared through the smoke, grabbing Ellie's arm. "You okay?" She nodded, coughing. "I'm fine. Just scared." "Good," he said. "Means you're still human. Help me with that fire." Together they worked through the night, hauling buckets of dirt and sand, choking on the acrid smoke. By dawn, the flames were out, but the smell lingered. Burnt oil, gunpowder, and something darker. After that, Ellie wasn't afraid of the noise anymore. The shelling became background music to survival. She learned to measure time not in hours, but in the rhythm of explosions and deliveries. But fear never truly left, it just changed shape. A week later, their convoy was ordered deeper inland. The roads were rougher now, cut through forests and fields where enemy patrols still roamed. Collins rode in the lead truck, while Ellie's vehicle followed behind. The driver hummed nervously under his breath. Ellie stared out the window at the blur of trees. The smell of damp leaves mixed with the faint, constant scent of gunpowder that seemed to cling to her clothes forever. When they reached a crossroads, they stopped for a brief rest. Collins walked over to her truck, his face serious. "There's been movement reported in the woods," he said quietly. "If something happens, if we get hit, you stay down. Understand?" Ellie nodded, though she wasn't sure she could promise that. She'd seen too much already to believe in safety. The next day, she wrote in her small notebook, "It's strange how normal the war feels now. I wake up, eat, carry ammo, duck when I hear shells, and then do it all again. I used to think bravery meant not being scared. Now I think it's doing your job, even when your hands won't stop shaking." Her handwriting wobbled as she closed the notebook. That night, she sat by the campfire with a few of the other transport girls. Someone had found a harmonica, and the faint tune of Blue Skies drifted through the smoke. For a moment, the war seemed far away. Ellie closed her eyes, imagining home, her mother's kitchen, her father reading the paper, her brother's laughter echoing through the house. "Do you think this will ever end?" Ruth asked softly beside her. "It has to," Ellie whispered. "People can't live like this forever." But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed it. The next morning dawned cold and gray. The air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath again. The trucks lined up for another run. Same route, same mission, but something in the air felt off. Collins did a quick check, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Stay sharp," he called. "The Germans know these roads too." Ellie climbed into her seat, her stomach tight with unease. She'd learned to read the mood of soldiers by now, and the silence today was worse than any noise. As the convoy rolled forward, the trees closed in, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The road narrowed, the mud deepening. She could smell the faint metallic tong of rain on steel, the ever-present echo of gunpowder that clung to her like a second skin. Somewhere ahead, a raven shrieked and took flight. Private McKinney muttered, "Bad omen." Ellie didn't answer. Her heart was already pounding. She didn't know it yet, but they were driving straight toward the day that would change everything. The day when the line between soldier and survivor would vanish. And she'd learned that courage isn't something you wear on your sleeve. It's something you find when the world leaves you no choice. The forest swallowed the convoy like a great green mouth. The trucks crawled through the narrow, rutted road, engines groaning, tires struggling against the sucking mud. The air hung thick with mist, every sound muffled except for the occasional creak of metal and the low hum of engines. Ellie sat rigid in her seat, gripping the edge of the dashboard as the trees leaned closer on both sides. Private McKinney tried to whistle, but it came out thin and nervous. "You ever feel like the whole forest's watching us?" he muttered. Ellie didn't answer. She could feel it too, that crawling sense of being observed, of eyes hidden behind every leaf. The birds had stopped singing an hour ago. Even the wind had gone still. Up ahead, Sergeant Collins' truck signaled a brief halt. The men stepped out to check the road. Ellie leaned out her window and saw him kneeling, pressing a hand to the dirt. He looked tense. Too tense. "What's going on?" She called softly. "Tracks," he said without looking back. Tank treads, fresh. A cold ripple ran through her chest. Collins gave a quick signal to the others. "Move fast, stay alert." The convoy rolled on, every head on a swivel now. The mist thickened, curling between the trees like smoke. Minutes later, the world exploded. A deafening crack split the air, followed by the shriek of metal. The lead truck lurched, then vanished in a cloud of dirt and fire. Ellie was thrown sideways as McKinney slammed the brakes. A shell had hit dead on, tearing through the front vehicle like paper. The woods erupted in gunfire. Bullets hissed through leaves, snapping branches, pinging off the truck bodies. "Ambush!" Someone screamed. Ellie's heart hammered as she ducked low, her ears ringing. McKinney grabbed his rifle, shouting over the chaos. "Stay down, Ellie. Stay down." But she couldn't just stay down. Through the smoke, she saw Collins stagger out of the burning lead truck, one arm bleeding badly, waving for his men to take cover. The fire was spreading fast, and in the back of that truck were crates of ammunition. If they went up, the entire convoy would vanish in a single blast. "Ellie, don't!" McKinney shouted as she shoved the door open and ran. The ground shook beneath her boots as another shell hit nearby, spraying dirt into the air. She stumbled, half blind, until she reached the burning truck. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with smoke. Collins was coughing, his face streaked with blood and soot. "The ammo!" Ellie shouted. "We have to get it out before it goes." He shook his head. "It's too late, get back." But she didn't listen. Her hands burned as she tore at the straps holding the crates. The wood was hot, splintering under her grip. She dragged one free and tossed it clear of the flames. Then another, and another. Collins tried to pull her back, but she fought him off. "Ellie, you're going to get yourself killed," he barked. "Then I'll die doing something that matters," she shouted through the roar. Another explosion rocked the ground, closer this time. Dirt rained down. Somewhere behind them, a soldier screamed. But Ellie didn't stop. She worked until her arms trembled, until her throat was raw from smoke. Finally, they pulled the last crate free. Collins grabbed her by the arm and dragged her behind the wreck, just as the flames reached the remaining shells. The blast threw them both backward into the mud. The air punched out of her lungs. For a moment, everything went white. When the ringing in her ears faded, she opened her eyes to chaos. The convoy was half destroyed. 2 trucks burned fiercely. Men shouted orders, returning fire into the trees. Collins was beside her, coughing hard, his face pale. "Radio," he croaked. "We need backup." Ellie scrambled to the communications truck, dodging debris and gunfire. The radio operator was slumped over his desk, motionless. Her stomach twisted, but she didn't have time to think. She pushed him aside gently and grabbed the transmitter. "This is Supply Convoy Echo," she yelled. "We're under attack. Coordinates north of St. Lay. We need air support now." "Repeat now." Static hissed back at her. Then a faint voice broke through. "Copy that, Echo. Hold position. Reinforcements inbound. Hold position." That was easier said than done. By the time she ran back, Collins was directing the defense. He'd set up a perimeter behind overturned crates and broken axles. Ellie ducked beside him, clutching a rifle someone had dropped. "You know how to shoot?" he asked, reloading calmly, despite the bullets whistling overhead. "Point and pray, right?" she said, forcing a grin that didn't reach her eyes. He smirked. "That's one way." She aimed toward the tree line, her hands trembling. Shadows flickered between the trees. Enemy soldiers moving fast, firing from cover. She squeezed the trigger, the recoil jolting her shoulder. The rifle's report rang loud in her ears. She didn't know if she hit anything, but she kept firing, kept breathing, because stopping meant dying. For what felt like hours, the firefight raged. Mud splattered her face, smoke burned her eyes, and the acrid tongue of cordite coated her tongue. Collins was everywhere at once, shouting, dragging wounded men to safety, firing bursts from his carbine. Ellie followed his lead, her fear drowned in adrenaline. Finally, the distant rumble of aircraft engines rolled across the sky. She looked up, blinking through the smoke. Allied planes swept overhead, dropping strafing fire across the enemy lines. The forest erupted again, but this time the explosions belonged to their side. Within minutes, the shooting died away. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of flames and the groans of the wounded. Ellie slumped against a wheel, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her ears still rang. Her hands were blackened with soot and blood that wasn't all her own. Collins limped over, sitting down beside her. "You did good," he said quietly. "I almost got myself killed," she muttered. He smiled faintly. "That's what good means out here." They sat there for a while, listening to the faint hum of distant planes and the hiss of rain starting to fall. Drops sizzled against the smoldering metal. When the medics finally arrived, Ellie helped load the wounded onto stretchers. Her muscles ached with every movement, but she refused to rest. One soldier grabbed her wrist as she passed. A young man, barely 18, eyes wide and glassy. "Did we make it?" he rasped. She squeezed his hand gently. "Yeah," she said. "We made it." That night, what was left of the convoy limped back to base. The once bustling trucks were now charred skeletons, their cargo half gone, their people fewer. Ellie sat in the back of a rescue vehicle, staring at her hands. They were blistered, raw, trembling. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something new, a strange, quiet strength. When they reached the camp, Collins approached her again. His arm was in a sling now, his uniform streaked with grime. "You disobeyed orders today," he said evenly. She braced herself. "I know, sir." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good thing you did?" She let out a shaky laugh. "So, I'm not in trouble?" "Not unless being brave counts as a crime," he said, turning away. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw fire. But mixed with the fear was something else, pride. For the first time since arriving, she felt like she belonged. Not just as a helper or an observer, but as part of something bigger. War had taken pieces of her, innocence, safety, the illusion of distance. But it had given her something too, purpose. She wrote in her notebook again before dawn. "Today, I saw what courage looks like. It isn't loud. It isn't fearless. It's just stubborn. The kind that refuses to back down, even when the world burns around you." Outside, the sun rose over the camp, pale and red through the smoke. The day everything went wrong had changed her forever, and deep down, Ellie knew the real battle was only beginning. The days after the ambush blurred together, stitched by exhaustion and adrenaline. The convoy survivors were reassigned to new units, scattered across the French countryside, where the war still clawed forward inch by inch. Ellie stayed with Sergeant Collins' group, a battered, makeshift supply team now tasked with running ammunition through unstable front lines. The camp had moved deeper inland, near the town of St. Lai, or what was left of it. The town was nothing more than blackened rubble and silent streets. Church steeples lay cracked in half, homes reduced to splinters, the air still carrying the faint smell of smoke. Each morning, the soldiers moved like ghosts through the ruins, loading trucks, hauling crates, checking maps. Ellie barely slept, her dreams still echoing with explosions. Sometimes she'd wake gasping, certain she could still hear the forest screaming around her. Ruth, the nurse, tried to make her eat, make her rest. "You're no good to anyone half dead, Ellie," she said one night, handing her a tin of soup by the campfire. "I'm fine," Ellie murmured, though her hands trembled as she held the spoon. Ruth gave her a long, knowing look. "You saved half that convoy. It's okay to feel something about it." Ellie stared into the flames, watching the orange light flicker over the mud-stained letters she kept folded in her pocket. Letters home. None sent. What could she possibly say? That the girl they'd raised to play piano and read poetry now hauled bullets through hell? That she'd seen faces she'd never forget, eyes open and staring at nothing? She folded the letters tighter. "If I start feeling it, Ruth," she whispered, "I'm not sure I'll stop." A week later, a new mission came down. A crucial supply run to a forward position near Coutances. The road ahead was unpredictable. Recent fighting had torn it apart, but ammunition was running low on the front. If they didn't deliver, entire companies would be left defenseless. Ellie checked every tire, every crate, every strap twice. Collins caught her doing it and grinned. "Still trying to outwork everyone?" "I'd rather be tired than sorry," she said without looking up. He leaned against the truck beside her. You know, some of the men started calling you Hellfire Hartman. She blinked, caught between disbelief and laughter. Hellfire? He shrugged. You ran through fire, dragged ammo out with your bare hands. You earned it. Guess I've had worse names. Their eyes met for a moment. Not romantic, not yet. Just two people who understood the fragile thread holding them together out here. Then Collins turned, his voice soft. Just keep your head down this time, all right? She smiled faintly. I'll try. No promises. The convoy left at dawn. Fog still hugged the ground, and the air was heavy with the metallic scent of rain. 5 trucks rolled slowly along the broken road, each packed with crates stacked high. Collins rode up front again, scanning the terrain through binoculars. Ellie followed 2 trucks behind, her heart drumming in rhythm with the engine's steady rumble. Hours passed with no sign of trouble. But trouble never announced itself. It just arrived. The first warning came as a dull thud under the tires of the lead truck, then a blast that lifted it clean off the ground. The explosion threw mud and debris into the air. Ellie's truck skidded sideways as McKinney swore and hit the brakes. Landmine. Collins' voice shouted over the radio. Everyone out, now. Ellie barely had time to move before she was thrown from her seat. The world spun, then slammed hard. She hit the dirt, dazed, ears ringing. The smell of gasoline filled her nose. When her vision cleared, she saw flames licking up the side of the lead vehicle. Men scrambled for cover. Another explosion ripped through the road as secondary shells ignited. Collins was already dragging the wounded clear. Ellie staggered up, her head pounding, and ran to help. She reached a soldier pinned beneath a shattered crate. His leg was twisted unnaturally, his face white with shock. It's okay, she said, dropping beside him. I've got you. She tried to lift the crate, but it was too heavy. She strained until her arms shook. McKinney, I need help here. No answer. Only gunfire echoing faintly in the distance. The Germans must have heard the explosion. Then Collins appeared, breathless, covered in dirt. He grabbed the other side, and together they heaved the crate away. The soldier gasped in relief. Get him back to the truck, Collins shouted. She nodded, wrapping her arms under the man's shoulders, dragging him inch by inch toward cover. Her back screamed with pain, her boots slipping in the mud. But she didn't stop. She never stopped. When they reached the truck, Ruth was already there, her hands red with blood as she worked on another wounded man. Ellie laid the soldier down beside her. Keep pressure here, Ruth said quickly, pressing Ellie's hands to a bandage. Ellie obeyed. Her palms grew slick with blood, her heart racing. Around them, the world was chaos. Shouting, smoke, distant shells thudding like angry drums. Then she heard a sound that froze her where she knelt. A single sharp crack, the unmistakable sound of a sniper shot. She turned just in time to see Collins stumble. He fell hard, one hand gripping his chest. David! She screamed, running to him. She dropped beside him, shaking. No, no, no. His eyes flickered open, unfocused, but calm. Ellie, he whispered, his breath shallow. You're all right? She nodded frantically, tears already streaming. Don't talk, just, we'll get you help, he coughed, blood staining his lips. No time. His fingers found hers, cold and shaking. Listen, you did more than anyone asked. You made it matter. Stop it, she sobbed. You're not dying. Not now. He smiled faintly. Hellfire Hartman. Don't ever stop fighting. Then his hand went limp. For a long moment, everything around her disappeared. The smoke, the shouting, the fire, it all blurred into a single hollow silence. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The man who'd seen her courage when no one else did was gone. A shell whistled overhead, snapping her back to reality. She forced herself to move, to grab his dog tags, to drag herself up through the mud. Tears burned down her cheeks, but she refused to leave anyone behind. Not him, not the others. By the time reinforcements arrived, the convoy was wrecked again. Half the men were dead or wounded. The supplies were lost. And Ellie Hartman, once the girl who only carried ammunition, had just lost the only person who made her believe she could be more than that. That night, rain poured over the camp like the sky itself was grieving. Ellie sat alone beneath a broken tent flap, Colin's dog tags clutched in her fist. She replayed his last words again and again. Don't ever stop fighting. Ruth found her there, kneeling in the mud. Ellie, she whispered softly, come inside. Ellie shook her head. He's gone because of me. He told me to keep my head down. I didn't. No, Ruth said firmly, kneeling beside her. He's gone because it's war. Because none of us get to choose who it takes. Ellie looked at her, eyes hollow. Then what's the point of being brave? Ruth reached over and closed her fingers around the dog tags. Because if we stop being brave, we stop being human. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The rain fell harder, washing away the blood, the dirt, the traces of another day survived. When Ellie finally stood, her eyes were different. The grief was still there, but something else had taken root beneath it, something sharper, steadier. She walked into the supply tent and sat at Colin's old desk. The map was still pinned open, dotted with red ink and scribbled notes. She stared at it for a long time before picking up a pencil. She drew a new line across the map, a safer route through the hills. The road he'd never get to finish. Then she whispered into the quiet, I'll finish it for you. That night, she began a letter to Colin's family. She didn't tell them how he died. Not the sound, not the fear, not the blood. She told them about his steadiness, his bravery, how he saved lives every single day without asking for thanks. She ended it with a line that trembled as she wrote it. He believed in courage more than safety. And he made me believe in it too. She folded the letter and tucked it into her coat. She would deliver it herself if she lived long enough to go home. Outside, thunder rolled far to the east, the sound of another battle waiting. Ellie closed her eyes and breathed in the rain. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was becoming someone else, someone made of loss and fire and defiance. The next morning, when the orders came to move out again, she didn't hesitate. Hellfire Hartman climbed onto the truck and took the wheel. The morning after Colin's death dawned pale and cold, the kind of morning that didn't feel real. The fog hung low across the camp, rolling in from the shattered fields like a silent tide. Everything smelled faintly of gunpowder and wet soil. Ellie Hartman sat on the back of a supply truck, fingers wrapped around a tin mug of coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink. The steam drifted upward, vanishing into the mist. The world felt quieter without his voice, too quiet. The camp commander, Captain Harlow, called for her not long after dawn. He was a hard man, gray at the temples, with the worn look of someone who'd seen too much death to flinch at it anymore. Hartman, he said, sliding a folder across his desk. Sergeant Collins' reports say you know the supply routes better than anyone left alive. Ellie's heart thudded painfully. She nodded slowly. I do. Harlow leaned back in his chair. Then you're taking over his unit. Temporarily, at least. We've got another delivery headed toward the front near Mortain. It's critical. And I need someone who can get it there. She stared at him, unsure she'd heard right. Me, sir? I'm not a sergeant. Paper says you're not, he said. War says you are. You've proven you can handle fire. You've proven you can lead. That's all that matters out here. Her hands tightened around the folder. The responsibility felt heavy, suffocating. What if I fail? She asked quietly. Harlow's expression softened. Barely. Then you fail trying. And right now, that's better than doing nothing. He stood, signaling that the discussion was over. You move out at 0600. Dismissed. Outside, the camp buzzed with morning chaos. Engines growling, boots slapping mud, orders barked over the roar of wind. Ellie walked through it all in a daze. The men glanced at her differently now. Not the way they once did, as a novelty. A woman among soldiers, but as someone who'd been through the fire and come out scarred, but standing. She found Ruth near the medical tent, washing blood from her hands in a bucket of cloudy water. You're leading them? Ruth asked when Ellie told her. Ellie nodded. They didn't give me much of a choice. Ruth smiled faintly, though her eyes were tired. Then don't lead like Collins. Lead like you. Ellie frowned. What if I don't know how? Then learn on the road, Ruth said simply. That's what we all do. By sunrise, the convoy was ready. 4 trucks this time, 2 carrying ammunition, 1 medical, 1 for spare parts and fuel. Ellie climbed into the lead vehicle, her heart pounding. The seat still smelled faintly of oil and smoke. Colin's old seat. As the engines rumbled to life, she took a deep breath. All right, she said into the radio, her voice steadier than she felt. Convoy Echo, let's move. The road to Mortain was a ruin. Bridges lay collapsed, and the countryside was scarred with shell holes. Smoke curled from distant hills. They passed the wreckage of other convoys, the metal twisted and blackened by fire. Each one whispered a warning. Don't make the same mistake. Ellie rode with her rifle across her lap, eyes scanning the horizon. Every shadow looked like danger. Every sudden sound made her flinch. But she pushed it down. She had to. Fear was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. By midday, rain began to fall, thin, cold, unending. The trucks slogged through mud so deep it pulled at their tires like quicksand. When they finally stopped for a rest, the men climbed out to stretch and light cigarettes. Private McKinney, now her driver and right hand, looked at her as he wiped grime from his face. You're doing all right, Sarge, he said. I'm not a sergeant, she replied automatically. He grinned. Funny, you're giving orders like one. Ellie smiled faintly despite herself. For the first time since the ambush, the weight in her chest lightened, just a little. Then came the distant thunder of artillery. She froze, head snapping toward the hills. The sound rolled again, closer. Mount up, she shouted. Now! The men scrambled back into their trucks. Engines roared to life. The convoy pushed forward, faster this time. But the sky above them was darkening, the air filled with a low drone of aircraft engines. Planes! Someone shouted. Ellie looked up just in time to see black dots swooping down from the clouds. German bombers. Get off the road. She screamed into the radio. The trucks veered toward a ditch line. Bombs began to fall, deafening, concussive, shaking the ground. The first blast sent dirt and debris flying. The second hit close enough to flip the rear truck onto its side. Ellie threw open her door and jumped out. McKinney, cover me. She sprinted through the chaos, mud splashing her legs, explosions tearing holes in the road behind her. She reached the overturned truck and could hear shouting inside. Men trapped. Hold on, she yelled, grabbing the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The metal was twisted. She braced herself and pulled harder, muscles screaming. A pair of hands reached out from inside, bloodied, trembling. She grabbed them, straining until the door gave way with a screech. Smoke and dust poured out. Ellie coughed, dragging the first soldier free. His face was burned, his eyes wild with shock. She pulled another out before the smell of leaking gasoline hit her nose. "Get clear," she shouted, pushing them both toward the ditch. She dove after them just as the truck went up in flames. The blast rolled over them like thunder. Ellie hit the ground hard, dirt raining over her. When the noise faded, she rolled onto her back, gasping. Her ears rang. Her body ached. But they were alive. She turned and saw McKinney rushing toward her, covered in mud. "Are you out of your damn mind?" he yelled. "You're gonna get yourself killed." She laughed weakly. Not today. The bombers finally retreated, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. The sky above was choked with smoke, but the convoy, what was left of it, was still moving. They'd lost one truck, but the rest survived. Ellie took a slow breath, brushing mud from her uniform. She looked around at the men watching her, waiting for orders. And that's when she realized it. They trusted her. Not because she was fearless, but because she wasn't. Because she kept going anyway. That night, they camped near a shattered farmhouse. The rain had stopped, leaving the world soaked and silent. Ellie sat alone by a small fire, a map spread across her lap. Every red line, every marked danger zone, reminded her of how much there was still to lose. McKinney joined her, dropping into the mud beside the fire. "You did good today, Sarge." She looked up. "We lost a truck. We saved 3, he countered. That's more than most manage these days." Ellie stared at the flames for a long moment. "Do you ever think about how much of this we'll remember when it's over?" He chuckled bitterly. "If it ever is over." She didn't answer. She couldn't, because deep down, she wasn't sure she'd ever leave this war behind, even if she did survive. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out Colin's dog tags, turning them over in her hand. The metal was cold, smooth against her skin. "Sometimes I think he's still here," she whispered. "Like he's watching, making sure I don't screw it up." McKinney looked at her, his voice softer now. "You're not screwing it up. You're keeping us alive." He'd be proud. Ellie smiled faintly. The first genuine smile in weeks. When the night grew quiet, she picked up her notebook again and began to write. "I used to think courage meant not being afraid. Now, I know it means being terrified and doing it anyway. Leadership isn't loud. It's heavy. It's lonely. But if it saves even one life, maybe that's enough." She closed the notebook, tucking it away as the fire crackled low. In the distance, artillery flares painted the sky red for a moment, and vanished into the dark. Tomorrow, they'd drive again, through new roads, new dangers. But for the first time, Ellie wasn't just following orders. She was writing them. She looked east, toward the faint glow of the front lines. The war wasn't done with her yet, not by a long shot, but she was ready for it. The days after Mortain bled into one another like a fever dream. The convoy pushed deeper through enemy-held territory, their maps worn thin and hope stretched thinner. The men had stopped asking when they'd make it home. Now they just asked where the next safe road was, if one even existed. Ellie had changed. Not visibly. Though her uniform was torn, her boots cracked, her hair streaked with soot and rain, but inside. She was quieter, sharper, the fear she once carried now fused into something colder. On the 4th morning after Mortain, the convoy rolled through a small French village, or what was left of it. The houses were gutted, the streets littered with broken glass. Smoke still curled from the blackened ruins. Crows picked at something unholy near the church steps. Private McKinney slowed the truck to a crawl. "Smells like trouble," he muttered. Ellie's hand rested on her rifle. "Keep the engine running." She climbed down from the cab, boots crunching over the debris. The air stank of rot and burnt wood. Her eyes scanned every corner, every doorway. Nothing moved. Until it did. A child stepped out from behind a toppled cart. A girl, maybe 8 or 9, her dress streaked with soot, her face hollow. She held something in her hands. Ellie froze. "It's okay," she said softly. "We're not here to hurt you." The girl stared back, eyes wide and empty. Then she dropped what she was holding, a tin can, and ran. Ellie exhaled in relief. But the can kept rolling, and she saw the wires. "Get down!" She screamed. The explosion tore through the air, ripping the front of the street apart. The shock wave slammed Ellie backward, throwing her into a wall. For a few seconds, all she could hear was the ringing in her ears and the echo of screams. When she opened her eyes, smoke filled the road. One of the trucks was on fire. "Ambush!" McKinney shouted. Gunfire erupted from the rooftops. German soldiers, hidden in the ruins. Bullets pinged off the trucks, tearing through canvas and metal. Ellie scrambled to her feet, grabbed her rifle, and fired back. "Form a line," she yelled. "Cover the wounded." The men spread out, returning fire from behind the vehicles. But the enemy had the high ground. They were pinned. Ellie crawled toward the burning truck, coughing through the smoke. Inside, she could see the driver slumped over the wheel, unmoving. Flames licked up the dashboard, the heat blistering her face. She tried the door, jammed. She pulled harder, ignoring the pain, until it gave way. She dragged the man out just before the fuel tank ignited, sending fire curling skyward. The blast knocked her off her feet again. When she looked up, 2 of her men were down, and McKinney was pinned behind a wall of debris. "Ellie!" he shouted. "We need to pull back." "Negative." She yelled back, her voice hoarse. "We're not leaving anyone behind." But the truth was clear. They were surrounded. She spotted movement near the edge of the square. A half-collapsed barn, its doors still intact. "Fall back to the barn," she ordered. The surviving men covered each other, sprinting through the hail of bullets. Ellie went last, firing until her rifle clicked empty. Then she grabbed McKinney's arm and hauled him through the door just as another grenade went off behind him. Inside, the barn was dark and smelled of dust and old hay. They shoved crates and barrels against the entrance, panting, bleeding, barely alive. "How many left?" Ellie asked. McKinney counted quickly. 7 out of 14. Ellie closed her eyes. "Half gone, just like that." One of the younger soldiers, Private Jameson, was crying silently in the corner, clutching his bleeding arm. Ellie knelt beside him, wrapping it with a strip of cloth torn from her own sleeve. "We're getting out of this," she said firmly, though her own voice trembled. "You hear me? You'll see home again." But she didn't believe it. Not yet. Hours passed. The gunfire outside had quieted, but no one moved. The enemy hadn't withdrawn. They were waiting, hunting. As dusk fell, Ellie pulled McKinney aside. "We can't stay here. They'll torch the place by morning." He nodded grimly. "There's a ravine just beyond the village. If we can make it there, we can circle around and rejoin the main column." She looked at the men, exhausted, injured, hungry. It would be suicide to move them all at once. "I'll draw their fire," she said. "You lead the others out through the rear." McKinney grabbed her arm. "Like hell you will. Someone has to," she said, her voice low but steady. "They'll chase movement. You can get them out while I keep them busy." He shook his head. "You can't save them all, Ellie." Her jaw tightened. "Maybe not, but I can damn well try." When night came, she slipped out through a side crack in the wall, keeping low. The moonlight caught the edge of her rifle. The air was still, too still. She could feel the enemy nearby, patient, waiting for noise. Ellie picked up a rock and threw it across the street. When it clattered against the stone, gunfire erupted. Muzzles flashed in the dark. That was her cue. She darted from cover to cover, firing short bursts, shouting to draw attention. "Over here!" She screamed. "Come and get me." The Germans shifted their fire toward her, just as she'd hoped. Behind them, she heard the muffled footsteps of her men escaping through the barn's back wall. But the trap closed faster than she expected. Someone circled behind her, a figure emerging from the shadows. A German officer, pistol raised. Ellie turned too late. The shot rang out, slamming into her shoulder. She dropped her rifle, pain exploding through her chest. The officer approached slowly, speaking in clipped German she couldn't understand. He motioned for her to stand. Ellie glared up at him, blood soaking through her sleeve. Her hand brushed against the grenade at her belt. She pulled the pin with her thumb. "For Collins," she whispered. The explosion lit the night sky like a second sunrise. When she woke, everything hurt. Her ears buzzed. Her body felt weightless and heavy all at once. She was lying in mud, the world around her glowing faintly orange from distant fires. McKinney's voice broke through the haze. "Ellie? Jesus, Ellie, you're alive." She blinked, seeing his face above hers, grimy, pale, but alive. He helped her sit up. The barn was gone. Smoke and rubble filled the village square. "You did it," he said. "You gave us a way out." Ellie coughed weakly, tasting blood. "How many?" "5 made it. We couldn't carry everyone." She nodded faintly. The numbers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that some lived. That Collins hadn't died for nothing. McKinney tore a strip from his jacket and pressed it to her wound. "We'll get you patched up. We'll find a medic." Ellie smiled faintly. "I'll hold you to that." He chuckled through the exhaustion. "You always do." As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the ruined village in gold and ash, Ellie sat in silence, watching the light rise over the dead. For the first time, she didn't feel like a soldier or a survivor. She just felt human again, fragile, broken, and somehow still breathing. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the pain and the scars, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she'd done enough. The morning of liberation was quiet. Too quiet. The distant rumble of artillery had faded. The fog rolled lazily across the broken French fields, revealing what remained of towns and villages the war had claimed. Ellie walked among the ruins with the surviving members of her convoy, her body aching and bruised, but her spirit heavier still. She had survived, but survival felt hollow. Every step she took over the mud-strewn roads carried ghosts, the laughter of boys who would never laugh again, the eyes of men frozen in disbelief, and the memory of Sergeant Collins, whose dog tag she still clutched in her palm. They reached the small clearing where a new Allied unit had gathered. Soldiers moved like a current, carrying wounded, distributing rations, and patching up equipment. Flags fluttered gently above makeshift tents. For a moment, Ellie allowed herself to breathe. "Made it," McKinney said, standing beside her, his uniform torn and stained like hers. His voice held a faint tremor, exhaustion, relief, and disbelief all tangled together. Ellie nodded silently, staring at the horizon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the broken landscape. Somewhere behind that line of hills, the world was beginning to reclaim itself. The days that followed were slow, filled with paperwork, medical checks, and endless marching orders. Ellie's shoulder was bandaged, but the ache inside her chest remained. She wrote letters she'd never send, letters to Collins, to Ruth, to the families of the men she'd tried to save. Words spilled across pages like lava, apologies, memories, promises she could not keep. Yet amidst the pain, a strange clarity emerged. She understood now that courage was not the absence of fear, nor the absence of grief. It was endurance. It was the strength to keep moving forward when everything around you begged you to stop. A week later, the convoy was reassigned to transport supplies to the liberated towns further east. Ellie led the group with cautious confidence. Every movement, every decision, carried the weight of past mistakes and hard-earned lessons. She issued orders clearly, efficiently, without the hesitation she had once felt. And yet, when the men looked to her, it was not just obedience they gave. It was trust. Trust that had been earned in the fire of ambushes, in the smoke of burning trucks, and in the quiet moments when she had chosen to stand instead of flee. One evening, after a long day on the road, Ellie and McKinney found themselves resting at the edge of a shattered orchard. The trees were skeletal, stripped bare by shelling, yet small buds of green hinted at the life still stubbornly clinging to the land. Ellie sat on a fallen branch, writing in her notebook by the dim light of a candle she had managed to scrounge. McKinney watched her, silent, until finally he asked, "Do you ever think about home?" She paused, pen hovering over the page. "All the time," she admitted. "But home isn't... It's not just a place anymore. It's memories, people, Colin's words, the boys who didn't make it. It's all that." He nodded, understanding in his gaze. "I think that's why you're still here, Ellie. Not just surviving, but carrying it forward." A lump rose in her throat. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm carrying too much." "Maybe," he said softly, "but someone has to." They sat in silence, listening to the wind rustle through the damaged trees. For the first time, Ellie let herself feel the emptiness she had been bottling for weeks. She cried quietly, the tears carving tracks through dirt-streaked cheeks. McKinney didn't speak. He simply placed a steady hand on her shoulder. And in that simple gesture, she felt the tiniest thread of peace. Weeks later, Ellie found herself standing before a small chapel in a town just liberated. The building had survived relatively intact, though the doors hung crooked and windows were shattered. Inside, civilians gathered to pray, to mourn, to rebuild. Soldiers passed through respectfully, their uniforms muddy and torn, but their eyes softened by relief. Ellie knelt quietly in a pew, dog tags pressed in her palm. She whispered words she had never spoken aloud, not to Collins, not to anyone. "I tried. I tried to honor them. I tried to keep us alive." The silence that followed was heavy but comforting. She realized, in that moment, that survival wasn't about guilt or triumph. It was about carrying forward what remained: courage, memory, and the fragments of humanity the war could not destroy. When she emerged from the chapel, the sun was setting. Its light bathed the ruins in gold, promising warmth after the cold. She looked around at the rebuilding townsfolk, at soldiers moving supplies, at children cautiously exploring their new world. It was fragile, everything was fragile, but it existed. Ellie inhaled deeply. She had survived, yes. She had carried ammunition, led men, saved lives, and witnessed horrors beyond imagination. And now, finally, she could carry hope too. The convoy's final mission was symbolic more than practical, transporting supplies for returning civilians, ensuring the last stretches of war-torn roads were safe for relief efforts. Ellie drove the lead truck, McKinney beside her, the rest of the men following quietly. No ambushes, no explosions, no death. Just miles of open road and the slow, steady rhythm of a world trying to heal. At one point, Ellie glanced at the horizon. She imagined Colin's voice beside her, steady and unwavering. She smiled faintly, a mixture of grief and gratitude. "We made it," she whispered. He had believed in her when she doubted herself. In that quiet, sunlit moment, she finally understood what that belief had meant. Not just courage, but trust in the human capacity to endure. When they finally reached the village where the supplies were to be unloaded, civilians cheered. Children ran alongside the trucks, waving makeshift flags, their laughter piercing the heavy air of the past weeks. Ellie stepped down from the cab, her legs trembling, and helped carry boxes of food and medicine. A small girl, no older than the one she had once tried to save in the ambush, tugged at her sleeve. "Thank you," the child said simply. No fear, no malice. Just gratitude. Ellie knelt, brushing soot from the girl's cheek. "You're welcome," she whispered. "Stay safe." For the first time, the war felt like a distant shadow. The horror remained, etched into memory, but the possibility of life, simple, fragile, and real, filled the space it left behind. That evening, Ellie wrote one final letter in her notebook. "To those I couldn't save, I carry you with me. To those who helped me survive, I owe you everything. And to myself, remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. We endure, because the world keeps turning, because hope persists, because life demands it." She folded the page and tucked it safely in her coat, knowing she might never read it again. The night sky stretched over the village, stars piercing the darkness. Ellie sat on the steps of a rebuilt house, dog tags in hand, listening to the faint sounds of life returning. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, calling the people to gather. Ellie closed her eyes and breathed in the cold, clean air. She was no longer just the girl who carried Hemo. She was a survivor, a leader, and a witness to courage in its rawest, most terrible form. And though the war had taken so much, it had given her something no one could ever destroy: the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, humanity could endure. She stood slowly, adjusting her coat. The road ahead would be long, and the scars would remain. But for the first time in months, Ellie Hartman felt ready to walk it, not as a frightened girl, not as a soldier, but as herself.